Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk about Klara and the Sun, the latest novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, and the first one since 2017 when he won the Nobel Prize. This review will have absolutely no spoilers. I like going into my books as blunt as I can, and quite often I avoid watching or reading other reviews because I feel like I get spoiled so often. So my reviews will always assume that you want to know as little as possible about the plot. I was quite nervous picking up Klara and the Sun because I've had a conflicted relationship with some of Ishiguro's works. Never Let Me Go is one of my top 10 favorite books ever, and I absolutely love that book, and I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And if you have not read it, you should just go read it now. Just go read it now. And don't watch any reviews, please, because the web is dark and full of spoilers, but it's an absolute must read. I also absolutely adore The Remains of the Day, and I think that is an absolutely stunning piece of art that should be on your TBR as well. However, when I picked up The Buried Giant, which is the book he wrote just before Klara and the Sun a few years ago, which was his attempt to experiment in the fantasy genre, if you like, I was left seriously underwhelmed, and I probably wasn't the only one. So picking up Klara and the Sun, I was a bit worried that it could be another Buried Giant, but at the same time I was quite excited that it might be another Never Let Me Go. But I'm afraid I'm leaning more towards the former now, and I'll explain why. We follow Klara, a form of artificial intelligence specifically built for companionship, and for that reason called artificial friend. Often abbreviated in the book as AF, which I found quite unfortunate given the meaning that most people attribute to AF as an abbreviation. And when we read about other robots called Boy AF. But anyway, we follow Klara, and she's currently in a store, clearly ready to be being sold to potential customers. And she interacts with the manager and other robots also in the store, and we get to experience the world and other characters through her eyes. Other characters are then introduced, the plot develops, but the pace of the story tends to remain on the slow side, and like his previous works, the tone tends to remain somber. It's definitely a book that calls for reflection rather than a fast-paced book full of action, and that's not necessarily like a good or a bad thing. It's just to set your expectations. One of the issues that I think I haven't seen raised enough is that this is currently being marketed as a science fiction book. It really doesn't feel like one. It really feels much more like a fairy tale or an allegory, where we're supposed to take things at face value rather than a science fiction sort of approach where we explore the implications of scientific discovery or technologies as they are introduced to our world. And Ishiguro himself admits in some recent interviews that this was initially conceived as a children's book, if a dark one, given some of the things that happen in the book. But it definitely feels a lot more like a fairy tale than a science fiction book. The story is told in first person through Klara's eyes, so we're in her head, rather her central processing unit, I guess, throughout the whole story. And we get to experience the world and her interaction with other characters and with other artificial units throughout the book. The depiction of her reasonings and thinking is quite interesting. However, I found it quite problematic and a bit not believable, because it feels more like the perspective of a child or an alien who's not used to the human world and kind of tries to make sense of what they see, rather than a robotic perspective, especially when it comes to a lot of the more easily solvable problems or issues that she faces that could easily find an answer on Wikipedia, but she comes to her own conclusions based on her own observations, which would be a pretty odd way of developing artificial intelligence, I would have thought. The other characters we also experience through Klara's eyes, so we don't necessarily know what they're feeling or what they're thinking, but we just see Klara's interpretation of their action. It also seems to me that they're more there, not as fully formed characters in the story, but more as devices for Ishiguro to present and represent specific instances and viewpoints in the world that we are observing. Similarly to the characters, we also get to experience the world through Klara's eyes, so we only get a limited perspective onto the world. This is set in the United States, in a world that is not too different from our own, but where some technology has been developed and it clearly had some meaningful impact on society. The technology is being the development of artificial intelligence, obviously, but also there's an element of genetic manipulation of human beings that is introduced later in the story. The world building was probably the most disappointing aspect of the book for me, because there are so many things that, in my opinion, are not quite consistent or just don't really make sense in the world as it's presented to us. And this comes back to what I was saying in terms of this feeling more like a fairy tale sort of setting where we're just supposed to accept things at face value rather than a fully formed exploration of what the impact of a technology would be in a world. What I found quite difficult to accept is that humans in this world would have developed this very sophisticated artificial intelligence capable of understanding and interpreting human emotions and responding to them in a very sophisticated and believable way. But at the same time, they will be completely lacking in knowledge or access to knowledge about very basic aspects of the world they live in. I find that quite difficult to accept in a way. And at the same time, during the story, Klara, who does these completely moronic things based on her own interpretation of how the world works, and not in terms of how subjective human things work, but about how objective things about the world work, and how she's completely incapable of making sense of these. But then at the same time, at one point, we've been told that she's tutoring one of the characters in their studies. So if these forms of intelligence are supposed to be ignorant in that way, then why are they being used for tutoring? Or it just seems just inconsistent overall. And you might think I'm nitpicking, but again, I place quite a high bar on writing by someone like Ishiguro, so I find it a bit sloppy the way some of these aspects of the world building are developed. We also see some parts of society seem to be completely unaffected by this technology, which again seems very peculiar. So for instance, cars and driving and taxis and all of this aspect of society seems completely unaffected by this amazing technology that has been developed, even though separately we see that robots are replacing humans in vast sections of society as workers. But at the same time, this very prominent part of our world seems to be completely unaffected. Also, Klara, this very sophisticated AI, seems to have the rendering capability of a Commodore 64, where if she moves too fast, she can't see things clearly anymore, and it takes several seconds to catch up. And again, in a world where that sort of sophistication exists when it comes to her interpretation of human emotions, I find it hard to believe that her capability of just having a decent camera included in the robot would be a challenge. And similarly, she gets disoriented and she's afraid of getting lost, and surely they can put a GPS into her. On top of that, we also have the son, who plays a prominent role in the story, as you will see if you read the book. Seems to be setting in the same place throughout the year, throughout the seasons, which, given that this is supposed to be the United States in a world that is pretty much our own world, is just against all laws of physics and astronomy, and seems a very odd thing, a very lazy device to adopt to develop the story. Like in Ishiguro's other works, his prose is absolutely stunning. It's never particularly flowery, it's always very simple, but very, very effective. And he just has a way with words where it just flows beautifully, and it's very easy to get through, really. You can easily read the book in a day or two if you want to. And we're talking about a Nobel Prize winner, there's not much more to say. The themes of the book is where it could have potentially redeemed itself. However, I also found that it fell slightly short for me as well. Obviously, the main theme is artificial intelligence and the way it could impact the world as we know it. And it touches on several aspects of it, from the very basic about etiquette around artificial intelligence. Is it to be treated like a vacuum cleaner or like a person? Onto the larger picture in terms of what impact would it have on society, displacing workers, and etc. So that's all quite interesting, but at the same time, it's been done several times before, and I didn't necessarily feel that he brought anything particularly new or groundbreaking to the discussion. Ishiguro also explores the theme of emotions, and we see the contrast between human emotions as experienced by humans versus those experienced by an AI. Because Klara repeatedly tells us she feels sadness, she feels happiness, surprise, etc. So what does that mean in the context of an AI? And he'll also contrast that with numbness, the lack of emotion and the defense mechanisms that humans put up to guard themselves against emotion. And that's definitely a very interesting exploration of that theme. And lastly, Ishiguro explores the theme of parenthood and the choices that parents have to make on behalf of their children, especially in the context of a new technology of genetic manipulation that is introduced in the book. And that is definitely something that could affect us all in the near future. So I find the way he explored this theme was actually very interesting and compelling. While there were several aspects to this book which were very interesting and still make it a worthwhile read, and despite Ishiguro's beautiful prose that make it just so easy to get through, I found overall the book just left me disappointed, mostly because of the underwhelming world building, but also because his exploration of the themes in the story was not necessarily something we haven't seen a few times before, and didn't really bring anything that substantial or groundbreaking to the conversation. So for this reason, my final rating for the book is 6 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you the next time.